Welcome to the Lutheran History Podcast, where we examine over 500 years of Lutheran history. Today, the tables are going to be turned once again, where we have a special guest host, Dr. Timothy Grunmeyer from Martin Luther College. He's going to be interviewing me on an upcoming article.
Well, thanks, Ben, for having me on again. I'm looking forward to discussing this paper with you. The title of it is A Cause of Distress, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of the West. It's a fascinating paper, and it's going to be published, as I understand it, in the upcoming issue of the Concordia Historical Institute Quarterly, which hopefully will be in print by the time this podcast is posted. So let's get started. I think the most basic question to ask at the beginning is, what was the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of the West?
Yeah, let's get our bearings here. That synod existed for only 12 years. And for anyone who studies 19th century Lutheranism, you almost give up in despair of keeping all the synods straight. So maybe why worry about this one? It's interesting for a couple of reasons. You can look at its name. It's the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of the West. And that's a pretty broad geographic area. It was founded, at least the preliminary meeting was in 1834. In Kentucky and Tennessee is where the guys started to meet for this. And when they meant the West, it is the old idea of the West. We have to remember this is before the Mexican-American War. So the United States does not own California or even Texas yet, or anything in that part of the country. Like the America really stops, realistically speaking, in the Mississippi Valley. That's like really as far west as you're really going to be getting it and considering it America. So they basically saw themselves as the Lutheran Synod for really the Ohio and the Mississippi River valleys. So Tennessee, Kentucky, parts of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Missouri. Those are the states that they wanted to operate in. It's really just a group of 4 or 5 guys who are Lutheran, who happen to be in those areas. And they said we should join together for a synod. There are obvious benefits to having a synod. Part of their function as pastors is to examine new candidates for the pastoral ministry. That's how they did it in those days. Most often they had the pastors examine a seminary student or someone who is presenting themselves as I'm trained enough to be a pastor. They were the ones who made sure that someone could serve as a pastor in their area. They noticed, it was quite obvious to them, as hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Americans are moving west across the Appalachians. Dozens and dozens of Lutheran settlements and congregations are being formed, or at least there's a potential for them, and there's no way to supply them with pastors. So they said, we want to make sure the Lutheran people are being served with the means of grace by reputable Lutheran pastors. No one else is doing it yet.
All right. So, Ben, could you tell us about some of the key personalities in this synod, the Evangelical Lutheran Synod of the West, from its founding through its brief run of 12 years? Because I think this shapes a lot of what you're doing in the paper.
Yeah. So the people themselves, for the most part, aren't especially famous, or they don't really have a huge impact on the history of Lutheranism in and of themselves. But the kind of people they were just kind of gets us a ground's eye, firsthand view of what Lutheranism looked like for what we'd today call the Midwest, when the Midwest was first being founded. What did people find in the Lutheran Church? What kind of pastors did they have? And some of these men had a lot of influence, at least locally, just based on their personality. They were the only guy there. And if they showed up at a synod convention or a synod meeting, and they had the biggest opinion, they could really shape policy in ways that we wouldn't expect in our larger synods that we are used to today. So the first example I have, he was at the original meeting, founding meeting in 1834. It's Jacob Kriegler. He was born in Culpeper, Virginia in 1776. He had a farming background. He served in the War of 1812. And somewhat unusually, for what we typically expect for pastors, it wasn't until he was 41 that he became a theological student. He was examined and licensed by the Pennsylvania Ministerium in 1819. And kind of uneventful for 15 years or so. He served a church in Pennsylvania, and he helped organize a new synod, the Synod of West Pennsylvania, in 1826. And we're not going to get into that today, but that kind of tells you a bit where his outlook was a little bit different from the older, more traditional conservative standard Pennsylvania Synod. He moved west at some point to serve a group of people. He became the pastor of Hopeful Church in Boone County, Kentucky. And he was in Louisville for the founding of the Synod, as I mentioned. The official founding in 1834. There was a 1835 was the founding. 1834 was kind of the preliminary meeting. Another guy that we hear a bit about throughout the brief history of the Synod of the West is Daniel Scherer. He was born in North Carolina in 1790. In his early 20s, he began studying for the public ministry under his brother, Jacob Scherer. This is typical for the time. This is before Gettysburg Lutheran Seminary is founded, the first kind of mainstream opportunity for Lutheran pastors to get a formal education in the United States. Most people, if they wanted to be a pastor in America, didn't travel to Europe to get a university education. They had the homeschool approach, which explains a lot about a lot of things. But a contemporary of Scherer, who was of a younger generation, Francis Springer, wrote of Scherer and his group of people that they were, quote, they were very poorly supplied with means of instruction, but grace and native vigor of mind were the best substitutes. So they had to be hardworking, driven individuals. They had to be good men, basically, and that really fits into the West in the early American Republic. You had to be a self-made man, self-taught, hardworking, and tough. Formal education wasn't deemed as necessary to be a pastor, as long as they knew the basics and had firm belief in their faith. That was good.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I noticed this as we've been talking here, that a lot of these founding pastors of the Synod of the West had a Southern background or a Southern connection, like the first you mentioned, and then also even William Jenkins, and even Abraham Reck had at least a brief period in Virginia too. So anyway, I'll let you talk more about some of these other guys.
Yeah, well, I don't know what to make of the Southern connection. It's just that, the westward expansion was largely driven by Southern people, just as much as it was in the North. But it basically, if you came from one East Coast state, you just hopped over to the one directly west, was at least the typical pattern for a while. People from Connecticut and New York and Pennsylvania all kind of funneled through Ohio. It kind of was a bottleneck there. So we see some of that, but Kentucky and Tennessee were some of the earlier strong points of Lutheranism in the Midwest, which we don't typically think of those states as being hotbeds of Lutheranism. But in the 1830s, it was, sky was the limit. So they were forming reality and patterns of generations to come, which was
and even this often gets overlooked, I think, but the parts of like Southern Indiana and Southern Illinois, these were heavily settled by migrants from Southern states, even though that they eventually, being on the other side of the Ohio River, become part of the what eventually becomes the North in the Civil War. So there's very much a Southern element to some of the southern parts of these Midwestern states. We often think of the Midwest.
Yeah, they call them like the butternuts or something like that. And I think we are kind of stuck with viewing things through a post-Civil War lens. Slave state, free state, North and South. Whose side were you on in the Civil War? That wasn't so much the divide back then as was the East versus the West, and we'll talk about that, I think, in a little bit. But these men are definitely making that transition. They probably wouldn't see themselves as Northerners or Southerners, but you can see in their synod's name, we are the Synod of not the West or not the South, but the West, even though they were what we would consider primarily Southern Americans. Now, Scherer, for example, he was able to speak in both English and German, which was handy because you have a large pre-existing German-American population already at the time of American independence and in the days of the early Republic, but it wasn't absolutely necessary. most people were at least bilingual. If you didn't know German and you were a Lutheran pastor, well, okay, we can make that work. That's one change we'll see coming up in the future, though, as being significant.
Are there any more of these kind of important personalities that you'd like to highlight?
You mentioned briefly William Jenkins. I'll just mention he was another guy who, was from the North Carolina Synod who moved east to Tennessee. He gave a report once to his parent synod. The North Carolina Synod isn't exactly the parent synod of the Synod of the West, but you can see there are a lot of direct connections between that synod, at least in the individuals. He wrote back to them once, just showing kind of a typical work year. He said, "I traveled 3,000 miles on horseback, preached 175 times, baptized 84 children, 14 adults, and admitted to church membership 34 persons, and had 8 funerals." And those kind of statistics show this is definitely a home mission, just kind of a missionary kind of mindset. But even then, a pastor in a mission setting today wouldn't have as difficult time with transportation. Not only was it on horseback, okay, that stinks, from our modern comfort level, but also just the infrastructure back then. They didn't have roads or bridges. There was no way to, they didn't have ditches even, so you can have flooded roads and mud and ice. And just another missionary of the time mentioned he almost died several times just spending 1 year in this part of the country, just trying to move from point A to point B. So you're putting your life at risk basically by being a missionary pastor back then, but pretty much everyone else put their lives at risk doing their everyday job too. So I thought that was interesting, just the amount of work it took to be a pastor in the Synod of the West. Another figure who maybe is a little more on the intellectual side, or at least interesting as far as his theology is concerned, is a man named Abraham Reck. He gets a little more note from contemporaries. He was considered an American Lutheran. He was a big supporter of the General Synod, something we've talked about a bit on the show before. He was also homeschooled, but he was also a little more educated. He was personal friends, according to some, with guys like Benjamin Kurtz and Simon Schmucker, so he shared his views. He's a bit of an enigma as far as his Lutheran views are concerned. He was a supporter of those new measures, so trying to adopt the Second Great Awakening or adapt it to Lutheranism. He claimed to be the first Lutheran pastor to ever hold a revival. I don't know if that's true, but that's interesting that that's a claim that he was willing to make. Some of his parishioners, this was back east before he came west, accused him of being a Methodist, quote, and a fanatic because of that, holding a revival. But he had enough support to campaign about that. But it's also interesting that although he did a lot of stuff we would consider un-Lutheran today or non-Lutheran, he was a personal fan of Luther, he said, and also he loved Luther's catechism. This was typical for the day. What people who we maybe wouldn't consider to be confessional Lutherans at all still really liked Luther's catechism. They really liked that education of children was an important thing. He's also credited with using the Augsburg Confession to correct someone who had become a Universalist, who had a Lutheran background. He said, "Well, don't you know the Augsburg Confession? We should turn it around." So he was willing to use the Lutheran confessions maybe with Lutherans, but then when he was the new guy in the scene, being the missionary pastor, someone asked him, "So what new sect, what new creed are you bringing into town?" Because this is the day when it seems like everyone has their own brand new religion that they're founding. He answered with a very typical populist American religion response. He said, "The Bible is our creed book." He didn't mention any of the Lutheran confessions. He just said the Bible is our creed book, which is what we would view as sola scriptura today. But there's a whole nother way of viewing that back in those days too.
Definitely. And there's another guy that jumped out to me as really interesting, just a very unique background in American Lutheranism in the 19th century. It's John Jacob Lehmanowsky. Is that correct?
I think I haven't heard it pronounced by anyone else, but that's how I would pronounce it too. Yeah. He's definitely, he does not fit the pattern of these early leaders. For one thing, he's foreign born. But his background is just, if it's true, I only half believe it because it's so amazing what he claims about himself. But everyone else seems to believe him. There was one time someone tried to discredit him, and I think the rest of the town like threw the critic out. But John Jacob Lehmanowsky was supposedly born in or around Warsaw in modern day Poland. At that time, it was part of the Kingdom of Prussia. He had some Jewish ancestry, according to some people, but he converted to Christianity in the university. But then during the time of the French Revolution in the 1790s, he went to France, a little hazy on the timeline there, and he joined the French army, first the Republican Army, then part of Napoleon Bonaparte's Imperial Army. And there's an anecdote where supposedly as a Protestant, he just said Protestant, so I don't know, was it Lutheran, was it Reformed? There wasn't quite the Prussian Union yet, so I don't know what he meant. Obviously, he later associated as a Lutheran later in life. But the Emperor Napoleon once asked him why he was not kneeling down for a Roman Catholic religious procession, and apparently he said to Napoleon himself, "I cannot, I am a Protestant." So that's an interesting story. By his own count, he fought in over 200 battles or engagements throughout the Napoleonic War and was wounded 14 times. At the famous Battle of Austerlitz, he claimed he received a severe sword wound near his mouth. And I'm going to use his picture as our episode thumbnail. You can look at his picture. There's undeniably a large scar on his face. Don't know if it's from a sword in battle or he got it some other way, and that's just a good story he's telling. I honestly don't know. It seems too much to believe. He also claimed to have survived the famous 1812 retreat from Moscow, living on rotten horse meat for 37 days. He supposedly was on Marshal Ney's staff at the Battle of Waterloo. And then he escaped, according to one guy, with the classic blankets into a rope out of the prison window when he was going to be executed for going against the French monarchy. And then he sailed to New York City. So it seems like if anything famous happened in Europe during 25 years, he was there and he played a role in it. At this time, you also have in Western America, especially, the lost Dauphin, the lost Prince of France. You get a lot of imposters claiming they're either French royalty or they were Napoleon's best friend or something like that. So just knowing the historical context, I'm kind of questioning whether or not this guy really is who he says he is and really did all this stuff. I tried just a Google search in like Napoleonic histories, and he didn't really show up. So you would think someone who's done this much stuff would show up in some broader history, but I'm not a Napoleonic scholar by any means. But anyway, this guy with all this military experience suddenly, for some reason, and it's not really explained, wanted to be a Lutheran pastor in the West. And he was. Okay. And his track record in the synod leaves no complaints for decades. In fact, we see him being that tough guy traveling from town to town, preaching from town to town. So he really fit in with the other guys in the synod, even though he had a very unique, very different background, whether his claims were true or not.
Interesting. And I guess there's one other person we have to bring up, because I think the article that you wrote kind of turns on his entry into the synod. And that's someone you're quite familiar with, Friedrich Wyneken.
Yeah.
You want to say a little bit about him?
Yeah. So he comes to America in 1838. So, 3 or 4 years after the synod is founded, he kind of stumbles his way into being a missionary for the Pennsylvania ministerium. It just so happens that they got a letter from the Fort Wayne congregation saying our pastor has died suddenly. He was a young man, just a year older than Wyneken. And they need a guy. Why don't you? Well, they didn't really send him there, actually. They sent him out as a missionary, but he found the congregation without the pastor. Then the congregation asked him to stick around, and he got permission to do so. So he was in Fort Wayne, and then there's the congregation in Friedheim. So he still continued his circuit. But since Hoover, his predecessor, was part of the Synod of the West, he joined the synod without ever meeting in person any other pastor in the synod or going to any of its conventions, which was kind of odd. But basically, I'm in your turf. My congregation suggested I join your synod, so I'll join it. But what we notice coming up is Wyneken represents that German element in the Synod of the West, and not just the German-American element that's comfortable speaking English and German, the German immigrant wave, which is growing and growing and growing. And we see this throughout the Synod history in the minutes. We see saying, well, in this part of Indiana, there are 4 towns that could serve German-only congregations. We have other pastors in the Synod of the West saying, I can't work with these people. I don't speak German, and they don't speak English. And then we see requests from other parts of the Synod saying, you're only printing the minutes of your Synod in English. You said you're going to do it in German and English. Why aren't you doing that? And we notice this response of the American Lutherans are really mostly only comfortable working in English, and they also have this mindset, we need to Americanize these immigrants. If we're going to be an American Lutheran church body, they have to eventually learn how to be American. They don't really force it. They are willing to work with individuals and their beliefs, but we see this disconnect of it's a cause of distress, is what I say for Winnikin, because he sees the needs of the German immigrant community is not being met. And in fact, he goes back to Europe after a couple of years and goes on this huge, very important tour where he's saying, we need pastors for these thousands and thousands of German Lutherans who aren't being served. And some of them are losing their faith. Some of them are waiting for years and nothing's happening. Others are joining like the Methodists and other groups, which is harmful to their faith because of their false teachings. And on top of it all, he says those American Lutherans, A, aren't doing anything about it. B, they're powerless to do anything about it. And C, their doctrine is so bad that if they do actually get their hands on these German Lutherans, they're going to corrupt them or lead them astray with false doctrines, especially concerning the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper. So he's working within the Synod of the West before he leaves without really being familiar with it, but he's sensing the disconnect. And then his famous appeal, called the Notruf, typically is largely a response to the Synod of the West without really naming names. That's what it's about.
Yeah, no, that's good. And you kind of hinted at this already, but I mean, what a lot of your paper ends up exploring are these various points of tension within the Synod of the West. I mean, almost from the get-go. So you have kind of the geographical tension of Western Lutherans, and again, West meaning, as you described it at the outset of the podcast, and kind of the Eastern Lutherans that it seems to me aren't really fully supporting them as much as they would like. And then you also have these linguistic divisions and between English speakers and German speakers, and especially this is becoming more of a problem as more and more German immigrants are coming in to the Western states. And then obviously you have the theological divisions as well. And these are central tensions to the Synod of the West almost from the beginning.
Yeah.
Too. So I don't know, do you want to say how these divisions kind of shape the Synod of the West's brief history?
Well, and I want to give, historical credit where it's due. Those men of the Synod of the West, they were hardworking men. Obviously, if you're preaching 175 times a year, which there are only 52 Sundays in the year, let's just make that clear, plus your holidays, if they're doing that, maybe 60 times. That's so well over double, kind of almost triple the amount of times preaching. They are working very, very hard, most of them. So I don't want to fault those individuals. They are aware of the issues. A phrase I worked into the paper was the impotence yielded apathy. After a while of just seeing we are powerless to serve everyone ourselves, I guess we can't lose sleep over it. We've got more than enough work to do. We can't learn German while we're doing all this work, and we don't know any other German people about it. The thing that the tricky thing is the doctrine, where they already had their American Lutheran doctrinal viewpoint. They were very, at these early 1830s, still even early 1840s, very respectful by and large of the General Synod. They were General Synod people. They joined the General Synod pretty early on. They liked the Lutheran Observer. They officially endorsed the Lutheran Observer. They liked Samuel Simon Schmucker. So, Freck was a personal friend. So the doctrinal differences, they were that was one area they weren't really willing to talk about or make any self-examination over. When in my other interview that we did on the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung, as soon as the doctrinal issue between the confessional Lutheran view and the American Lutheran view came out in the press, they instantly, without even examining it, said the Lutheran Observer is the paper of the church, they said, and anyone else is just causing divisions. So don't read it. Was basic. Don't read the Lutherische Kirchenzeitung. They kind of blacklisted Schmidt and his paper for being confessional. So they really tuned out any doctrinal conversation, at least on the official level. And then when Wyneken comes back, through his personal efforts, the Fort Wayne area and really northern Indiana and southern Michigan, he was faithfully serving and organizing a dozen congregations or so, and he was writing letters to Europe saying, "Hey, can you send me this guy?" Or, "Hey, you and I went to college, university together. Can you come over? I have a spot for you." He was kind of working as his own little circuit without really officially having that authority, but he was working directly with Europe to fill these German congregations with German pastors. So suddenly 1843 comes around, he's back from Europe. He has a couple allies now, and the Synod of the West is made up of many more German congregations and pastors. And it's interesting, they have a synod meeting, they have some discussions. It doesn't get too heated, but you can tell there's a difference because Wyneken goes off with his German guys and they sing "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" in German. And the American Lutherans are left in the other building just saying, "Well, isn't that cute?" is basically what they say. "Wasn't that nice? Those Germans are homesick and they're singing in German." Then a year later, it all kind of falls apart where Ezra Keller wants to start a new seminary and it's not going to be confessional. And Wyneken says, "We cannot cooperate with this. It's un-Lutheran. It's un-Christian because of its heresies it's espousing." And it turns out that there are enough German people there on the first day of the conference to vote down the seminary proposal. But then as people are, riding in on horseback, "Oh, sorry, there's too much mud in the road," or, the bridge was out. The Americans, as they're called by contemporaries, show up and then they overrule the German Lutheran decision at the Synod Convention. So it's just chaos where it's clearly divided, and then they realize we're not going to be able to work together. They never say it, but then I think it's just assumed this project of working together isn't going to happen.
And something that I hadn't never put together before until I read it in your paper was it's at the convention where they're debating these issues in the Synod of the West that Wyneken first encounters Der Lutheraner, the Missouri, it's not the Missouri Synod quite yet, paper founded by C.F.W. Walther, which eventually become the chief paper of the Missouri Synod. At least, that's the is that in the biography of Wyneken where this is made? Maybe that's another one of those stories that's too good to be true. I don't know what you think, but
that actually, when my Wyneken study, that event was something I took a lot of time trying to nail down, and I had to there are conflicting accounts as to when he first got his hands on Der Lutheraner. One person makes it seem like he first got a copy from Wilhelm Seeler in 1845 when he was visiting him for the first time. His daughter Emma, writing 100 years after the event, said, "Oh, he first read it in Baltimore later in the 1840s. Contextual evidence rules that out. She's just not remembering it right. She wasn't even born yet at the time. What the immediate context says, Adam Ernst, who was a Wilhelm Leah Sendling, a missionary, apparently connected Wyneken with Der Lutheraner, because already they were starting to realize we're not going to be able to make this work probably with these American Lutherans. We should be seeing where the other confessional German Lutherans are in the country. So this would have been in the fall of 1844, so just a couple months after that very first issue of Der Lutheraner. But apparently Wyneken, when he first saw it, said, "Thank God there are still even more real Lutherans in the country." He was just at this kind of difficult point encouraged by the fact there are other people who thought pretty much just like him.
Yeah.
And the rest of the people.
Yeah, that was a neat anecdote. I guess final question on the paper itself is, I mean, it's a great read, but you also get into some reasons why this short-lived synod, the Synod of the West, it only lasts for 12 years, why its legacy is significant. I mean, there's a lot of these kind of short-lived synods that spring up in the 19th century and then kind of fade away. Why does the Synod of the West matter?
Well, in a small way, and pretty much all these other short-lived synods can make this claim. Well, they fed into other more important, more famous synods, so their DNA somehow made it into other synods. They hit the self-destruct button, and I couldn't really figure that out. Why? There's no, like in the minutes, there's no record of this isn't working, we should divide into 3 micro synods, even though we're already pretty small. They never say why, and I think that part of it is kind of that general synod assumption that each state will have its own synod, and we're kind of like a federation, kind of like the United States is made up of 50 states, and we're governed that way. The American Lutherans said we're going to have a general synod governed by these, or built up of these smaller synods. So I think that's what was behind it, but there were obviously internal divisions. But they fed into some even smaller synods that, I mean, there's barely anything to write about. There was the Synod of the Southwest, which again is not New Mexico or Arizona. No, that's in those days Kentucky and Tennessee was the Synod of the Southwest. I don't even really know what happened to that, if they even met. There was the new Synod of the West, which was basically Indiana, and then the Synod of Illinois. The Synod of the new Synod of the West, that's where most of those German confessional Lutherans were. And basically in the very first meeting, they all just walked out and said, are we going to follow the Lutheran confessions or not? No? Okay. Come on, guys, let's go over here and found our own synod. So they founded the Indianapolis Synod, which eventually merged, not instantly, but took a while, but merged with the Missouri Synod. Same can be said for the Illinois Synod. The Illinois Synod was definitely much more an American Lutheran synod for a while, but then eventually the German confessional influence kind of took that over, and I think it's in 1875 or thereabout it merged with the Missouri Synod. But within the Illinois Synod, there's an interesting legacy of the Synod of the West correctly identified a need to have a Western seminary to train pastors for service in the Midwest. You just couldn't rely on the East Coast to get it done. You have to have local seminaries, which was all fine and good. So they founded a seminary in Springfield. Francis Springer was a Synod of the West pastor, then later in the Synod of Illinois. He was, according to him, neighbor and friend with Abraham Lincoln himself, and that's interesting for obvious reasons. But that seminary in Springfield went through a couple changes, and eventually that's the campus where Missouri Synod used for their theological seminary. So if not a direct descendant from the Synod of the West seminary, at least the building and the idea of having a seminary there, there's a connection. But perhaps the greatest legacy is felt in the reaction to the Synod of the West's failures. So it provided contemporary confessional Lutherans with an open target for attacking doctrinal weaknesses and heresies. It gave German immigrants, although they had several years of trying to make it work, ample justification for going their own way, because the American Lutherans weren't going to serve the German demographic, just as the tide of German immigration began to swell. So it's kind of the perfect storm. They're not serving us. There's more of us. Their doctrine's bad anyway. We might as well found the Missouri Synod and other synods. But it also fits in that broader American pattern of Western or Midwestern institutions becoming independent from the East Coast. And that fits in a broader American history. So a lot of good legacy, but you can see some tangible elements to this day.
Yeah, and I mean, it strikes me, I mean, you asked me what I kind of thought of the significance of this before we started the podcast. And I mean, if I would sum it up, it's kind of almost a microcosm of so many of the different tensions in the antebellum United States and in the Lutheran Church. You know, as we've talked about over the course of the last couple of minutes here, you know, you have the German immigrant versus people who have traced their ancestry back several generations already in America. So if you will, the English versus German speaking element, you have the theological tensions, and just even the geographical divisions. I mean, you pointed out very well that a lot of the divide in Lutheranism building up to the Civil War, I mean, there is northern-southern tensions, but there's just as many east-west tensions, at least in the Lutheran Church, it seems to me. And a lot of it, too, is, a lot of these Eastern Lutherans wanting to support Western expansion, if you will. And by, again, Western, we're meaning kind of the Midwest. But as I read the papers of like the 1830s and 1840s and even early 1850s, there's always this kind of clamor like, oh, we need more pastors out here, but not as many people actually want to go out to the Midwest and leave kind of the comfortable confines of, Pennsylvania or
they go for a year, like a missionary tour, and then they get married and they say, I'm never doing that again. And if you send anyone else, don't make them try to be a missionary in 5 states on horseback. It's not going to work. That was Ezra Keller's approach. Yeah.
Well, and Ezra Keller is a great example of someone who, he only lives till he dies in his late.
I think it's 1848 is when he dies, I believe. Yeah.
And I think he only lives to either his late 30s or early 40s, if I'm not mistaken. But it's a tough life on the frontier. Well, cool. Let's maybe move on to talking about how you went about researching this article. Well, maybe just back up even further. Where'd you kind of get the idea to start researching this article, and what was kind of the impetus behind the project?
Yeah, well, as listeners are aware, I was working on just understanding Friedrich Wynneken's theological development. He went from being an awakened Lutheran, which is more or less, I sincerely believe in Jesus, and that's, I would say good enough, but that's what his focus is just sincere faith, to suddenly being very, this is what the true faith is. And the Lutheran confessions are completely correct in every way, being a confessional Lutheran. And somewhere he goes from being probably in agreement with most American Lutherans, or at least he's able to work with them. He tolerates them and they tolerate him. They're friendly, to being getting to the point where he shows up at a General Synod convention and vows to wage war on them and their heresies. Okay, that doesn't happen overnight. So how did he encounter American Lutheranism in his own synod, the Synod of the West? So that's what started it. And what started this project is, apart from one not so great article that's now over 100 years old from the Concordia Historical Institute from the 1920s, there hasn't been any historiography, any history written on this synod. So I thought, well, I should at least understand it if I'm going to understand how this one man who was part of it for most of its existence. Wynneken was even its treasurer for a couple years. He was an officer in the synod. How did he interact with it? So that's why I got into trying to understand the synod. And then I started to see there's a lot of value to it, as we mentioned. There are these themes of German versus English, of East versus West, Europe versus America, and confessional versus American Lutheranism. Just a lot of good stuff in there. The research process was, thankfully, almost all the synod minutes are available in English or in German. There's one year where it's just in German, but that's okay. And the ELCA archives in the Chicago area had them all on PDF and just said, oh, here you go. It was one of the easiest research projects I ever did. Was nice. They had all the minutes available, which is always a blessing. And then just looking at Wynneken's other writings and the writings of contemporaries. Ezra Keller's biography has the guy transcribed his journal who wrote his biography. He misspelled Wynneken's name, so it took me a while to realize, oh, that's actually Wynneken. He didn't get it right, but there's no other way it's anyone else, just based on context. So that was one little challenge in the research, but by and large, there were published or at least available sources.
Yeah, and the minutes of the Synod of the West, I mean, that makes up a large portion of the sources that you cite. I don't know, do you have any thoughts on the strengths of this type of source, the published minutes of published synodical minutes, and the weaknesses of that as a source? I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff in there, but there's also limitations. I don't know. What do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there's definitely weaknesses depending on who the secretary is. I would make a very bad just anyone listening, don't elect me as your secretary. I'm going to do I was always the student in class who thought if I could turn this 2-sentence answer into one word, that's what I will do. And I think sometimes they don't put as much detail in there. But it's almost like it's an editorial sometimes where, and they were all happy and there's always this feeling of brotherly love, which is true and fine probably. But sometimes it's definitely biased and it's recording discussions, but maybe not everything that was thought or maybe not everything that was said. And those are definitely the weaknesses of minutes. But at least it gives you a framework. But you could tell there was something missing because there was no discussion on why are we destroying this synod that we built and how do we feel about it? That wasn't there. So there's obviously something lacking, and I couldn't find it in other sources. I can tell communication was a problem because Wyneken only found out that his synod self-destructed by reading about it in a newspaper. He was the treasurer of the synod at the time, and he was in Baltimore, so he didn't attend the meeting. But yeah, they didn't even say, "Hey, we're planning on doing this. What do you think?" So I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I've noticed in my own research how, often, and this comes later on than the time period you're researching, but in say the 1850s or 1860s, some of the various church papers will print their own version of the minutes that have a lot more of the discussion recorded. I just random example, and I was looking at the 1868 General Council Convention the other day, and this is where they're debating the 4 points, which is this thing that's a hang-up between the Ohio and Iowa synods and the General Council. And in the official published minutes of the General Council, you have the resolutions that were passed and kind of just like who was on which committee and kind of the basic information. But then in the church papers, in the Lutheran and Missionary, they have a transcription of like the debates, so this theologian said this and then this pastor said that, and back and forth like that. But for a lot of these synods, they're not important enough, or even at this time that the amount of Lutheran church papers out there isn't large enough to do that for all the different synod convention. But it's interesting, you can kind of fill in some of the gaps with some of those sources sometimes.
Yeah, and the nice thing is and we were discussing about this earlier before we started the official podcast, there's so many autobiographies of individuals or biographies, or at least they had the journals or the letters and they just printed it, or at least parts of it. So if it's a big enough kind of meeting and there are important enough people showing up, you generally can get those different perspectives on it. The stuff that the juicy stuff for these Synod of the West meetings you get in Kirchliche Mitteilungen. They're published in Germany by Wilhelm Leah, but it's Wyneken or Adam Ernst are writing their reports back to Leah, and then he's publishing it for a German audience to understand what's happening in backwoods Kentucky, and you get more details from that.
That is really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I guess this kind of, maybe you've answered it already, but I'll ask the question anyway. Was there anything that was particularly surprising to you as you encountered this project that you weren't, expecting, or just particularly excited to find?
I was one of the big, and this is in my entire Wyneken project, one of my happiest discoveries was finding the Ezra Keller account of what happened. And he says, can you believe it? This Wyneken guy actually believes in the real presence in the Lord's Supper. And, and he's clearly defining what Wyneken actually believes in 1844. And this is, and sometimes people kind of Wyneken wasn't really that confessional until, and they fill in the blank. But no, he was very confessional, at least by 1843, 1844. So it kind of dialed back the clock a bit on his doctrinal development. So personally, for that subject, it was just amazing to hear a detailed description of what Wyneken believed as a criticism, where I didn't get that from himself. I never really got from Wyneken himself his own doctrinal transformation, but someone else was commenting on it. So
interesting. Cool. Yeah, that is cool. So you've got the article done, you've submitted it for publication, so it's done, right? Or do you still have any lingering questions that you would have wished you could have figured out, or maybe still some things that you want to do with the Synod of the West, or at least other times it might come up in future projects?
I think the appeal for doing this project was that it was short-lived. It had nice bookends to it, and the sources were generally available. So I don't want to say I've done a complete exhaustive study on it. No one else can ever find anything interesting or relevant about it. I'm sure people could take and really analyze the English versus German parts of it. But I think I covered most of the significant bits and episodes of that in this paper. So personally, I think it's pretty complete. It is part of the mosaic of 19th century American Lutheranism. I think it is very helpful for understanding the whole situation for a large part of the country. But no, I think I'm personally done with this project for now.
Cool. So what's next for you then, Ben? What's in the hopper coming down the line that you're working on right now?
Well, I am still finishing up that book chapter I talked about the communicating religion, looking at really just the 1840s American Lutheran publications and just how did people communicate and then debate religion in the open. I'm still working on that. But after that, I'll be taking probably a break from any new projects. I was just accepted into a program at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis where I'll be working toward getting a PhD. So instead of finding new things to do, I think I'll wait and see what that all means for me as far as studies are concerned.
You'll be doing what your professors tell you to write.
I'm under orders then, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds good. And yeah, that's awesome that you're starting that soon. Hopefully you can keep the podcast going during your studies.
Yeah, we'll see. Hopefully.
All right. Well, I've enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed the conversation today. I enjoy listening to the podcasts, and I hope the audience sticks around and keeps listening to more of these great episodes. We were talking about some of the other guests you have coming on down the pike, and I'm excited to hear what they have to say. I don't know anything. You're the real host. I'm the fake host. Anything you want to?
The guest of honor host is what you are. Yeah.
Anything you want to say before we sign off here?
Yeah. Well, I'll just say to our listeners, thank you for listening again. Hopefully, you found this interesting, and please do check out the research as it's published in the Concordia Historical Institute journal if you are interested in seeing the actual story with all the references and such. And in another 15 days or so, please tune in again for another episode